The morning Nellie Lockhart rode into Calico Creek, New Mexico Territory, the year 1883. She had $47 hidden in her left boot, $312 sewn into the lining of her right, and a loaded Remington Derringer tucked against her ribs that she would use before she let any man take either. She had learned that kind of caution in Missouri, in the town of Hannibal, where she had watched her father's savings disappear into the hands of a man who smiled too wide and shook hands too firmly, and promised the world with the easy confidence of someone who had never once intended to deliver it. She had been 22 years old then, standing in the doorway of the house her father had built with his own hands, watching a stranger walk away with the deed and the furniture and the silver candlesticks her mother had brought from Ohio. Her father had died 3 weeks later, not from any wound a doctor could name, but from something broken inside that no medicine touched. And Nellie had taken the money she had saved from 2 years of school teaching, every last cent of it, and she had divided it between her boots and ridden west before anyone could take that from her too. That was 14 months ago. In 14 months, she had learned to keep her own counsel, to sleep lightly, to read a man's intentions from the set of his shoulders before he ever opened his mouth, and to trust no one with the knowledge of what she carried. She had passed through 4 territories and 9 towns, doing school teaching and mending, and the occasional bookkeeping for merchants who needed ledgers they could understand. She saved everything she earned and hid it in the same 2 boots, and the weight of it against her ankles had become so familiar it felt like company. Calico Creek was supposed to be a stopping point, not a destination. She needed a room for a week, maybe 2, while she decided whether to push on to Santa Fe or turn north toward Colorado, where she had heard there was demand for teachers in the mining towns. She had no particular reason to stay anywhere. That was one of the truths she had made her peace with on the long road from Missouri, that the world went easier on a woman who needed nothing from it. She found the town's single hotel, a 2-story adobe building with a hand-painted sign reading the Cactus Rose, and she tied her mare, a sturdy gray she had named Patience, to the hitching post outside. The street was wide and dusty, the way all the streets in these territorial towns were, with a general store on one end and a saloon on the other, and a scattering of smaller businesses in between. There was a blacksmith, a barber shop, a small church with a crooked cross on its roof, and what appeared to be a land office with fresh whitewash on its walls and new lettering on its window. She was pulling her saddlebag from Patience's back when she heard the argument. It was coming from the land office, loud enough to carry through the closed door and across half the street. One voice was high and agitated, the other low and careful, and it was the low one that caught her attention the way a single clear note catches the ear in a room full of noise. The door opened before she could look away, and a man came out walking backward, which she supposed explained why he nearly stumbled over his own boots on the step. He caught himself on the doorframe and turned around, and Nellie Lockhart saw Gideon Fairchild for the first time. He was tall, somewhere in his early 30s, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that had grown a little long beneath a battered hat that had seen considerable weather. He wore a gray shirt rolled at the sleeves, plain canvas trousers, and boots that were worn down but well kept, the boots of a man who worked hard and valued the things he owned. His jaw was set with the particular expression of someone who had just been told something thoroughly unjust and was working very hard not to say so at the volume it deserved. Behind him in the doorway stood a shorter man in a new suit, shiny as a beetle, with a ledger book tucked under one arm and the expression of someone who had already decided how the world worked and found it convenient. "The survey says what the survey says, Fairchild," the suited man said. "The eastern boundary of your claim runs 40 feet shy of where you planted your fence. 40 feet. That puts the creek access inside Harlan Briggs's new purchase." "That survey was done by a man who works for Briggs," Gideon said. He was not shouting. She noticed that particularly he kept his voice level, but it had an edge in it like good steel kept in a scabbard. "Crawford, you know as well as I do that survey is wrong. I have been drawing water from that creek for 3 years. My deed shows the boundary. Your deed shows what it shows," Crawford said. "The new survey supersedes. That is not how property law works. It is in Calico Creek." The door closed. Gideon Fairchild stood on the step for a moment looking at the closed door, and then he took a long, slow breath and turned around. He found himself facing Nellie, who had been so absorbed in listening that she had forgotten to pretend she was not. For a moment neither of them said anything. He had dark eyes, she noticed. Not black, but a deep brown that caught the light the way still water does, reflecting more than it shows. "Sorry," he said. "Did not mean to make a spectacle." "You were not," she said. He was. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the precondition of one. "You heard all that." "Hard not to, I just arrived." She nodded at Patience, at the saddlebag still in her hand. "I am looking for the hotel." He stepped down from the step and pointed toward the cactus rose. "That is it. Clara Jennings runs it. She is fair and she keeps it clean." He paused. "You are passing through." "I expect so," Nellie said. "Most people are," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that suggested he was not talking only about her. He touched the brim of his hat, the automatic courtesy of a man who had been raised to do it. And then he walked in the opposite direction, long strides, unhurried despite what she imagined was considerable frustration boiling just below the surface of that controlled exterior. Nellie Lockhart watched him go for exactly 3 seconds before she turned toward the hotel. She did not make a habit of watching men walk away. She did not make a habit of thinking about men at all, if she was honest, which she generally tried to be. But she thought about those dark eyes for most of the afternoon, and she told herself it was just because she had not had a real conversation with anyone in 6 days. Clara Jennings was exactly as described: fair, efficient, no nonsense in the way of women who had built something from nothing and intended to keep it. She gave Nellie a room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked east toward the desert and a hook on the back of the door that actually held her coat without it slipping off. Nellie paid for a week in advance, removing the coins from her left boot while sitting on the edge of the bed with the door latched, and she hid the rest of the left boot's contents in the false bottom of her saddlebag before going downstairs to the dining room. The dining room served everyone, hotel guests and townspeople alike, and it was half full for the evening meal. Nellie took a table near the wall, back to the plaster, and ate roasted chicken and corn bread and drank coffee that was stronger than she was accustomed to, but welcome all the same. Gideon Fairchild came in an hour after she had started eating. He took a table across the room, sitting alone, and a woman Nellie assumed was a waitress. A young Mexican girl named Rosa. She would learn later brought him a plate without him ordering, which meant he ate here regularly. He had a folded paper in front of him that he kept looking at and then looking away from, and Nellie thought it was probably the deed he had mentioned, or the survey, or both. She was not watching him. She was simply aware of him the way you are aware of a fire in a room, not staring but cognizant of the warmth. He looked up once and caught her eye, and he lifted his chin in a small acknowledgement, and she turned back to her coffee. That was all. That was perfectly fine. After supper she walked the length of the main street in the cooling evening, learning the town the way she always learned a new place on foot, slowly, taking in the details that told you what kind of place it really was underneath the paint and the signage. The saloon was called the Copper Penny, and it was doing steady business. The general store, owned according to its sign by a man named P.M. Holt, had a notice in the window that said "Help Wanted, Inquire Within." The church, she noted, had a schedule of services posted on its door in neat handwriting that suggested the minister was thorough even if his carpenter was not. She stopped at the notice in the general store window and read it again. Bookkeeping, 2 days a week, fair wage. She did not need the work. She had enough in her boots to see her through 6 months without earning a single cent. But the habit of earning was deep in her, and standing still made her uneasy, and something about Calico Creek had not yet released her. She told herself it was practical. She had not yet decided where she was going next. A little income while she decided seemed sensible. She went back to her room and slept, and in the morning she pulled on both boots and went to see P.M. Holt. P.M. Holt was a stout man in his 50s with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, and a back room full of ledgers in a state that would have given a decent accountant nightmares. His real name was Percival Mordecai. He told her himself with the grim humor of a man who had made peace with a name through long exposure. And he was losing track of his accounts receivable because he had too many of them and no system for organizing them. Nellie spent 20 minutes in the back room and then came back out and told him what she could do and what it would cost him. He agreed without much negotiation, which told her she had probably offered too low, but the work suited her and she could be more assertive next time. She started that afternoon. She was deep in the ledgers, seated at the small desk Percival had cleared for her in the back room, when the bell above the shop door rang and she heard voices from the front. "Morning, Percy. Need 60 feet of fencing wire, and those records you mentioned." She recognized the voice before she could stop herself. "Right here, Gideon," Percival's voice. "Oh, and I have taken on a bookkeeper, you will be glad to hear. Miss Lockhart, are you able to come out a moment?" Nellie set down her pen and came out from the back room. Gideon Fairchild stood at the counter with a coil of fencing wire already set to one side and a folded receipt in his hand that he was apparently checking against Percival's records. He looked up when she came through the doorway, and there was a brief flicker of genuine surprise in his expression before it settled back into its habitual composure. "Miss Lockhart," he said. "Mr. Fairchild," she said. Percival looked between them with the satisfied expression of a man who has accidentally arranged something. "You two have met, briefly," Nellie said. "I nearly knocked her over coming out of the land office," Gideon said, and then he seemed to weigh whether that required elaboration. "I was not watching where I was going." "You were watching the door you had just left," Nellie said, and because she could not quite help herself, she added, "which seems like reasonable caution given what was behind it." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "You have an opinion about the land office business. I have an observation. Whether it rises to an opinion is another matter." She folded her hands in front of her. "That man in the suit does not work for the county. He works for whoever owns the land company. Surveyors who work for land companies have a particular way of running their lines." Something changed in Gideon's face. It was not the look of a man being flattered. It was the sharper, more complicated look of a man being understood. "You know something about surveying." "I know something about being on the wrong side of a rigged measurement," Nellie said. "And I know that deed law in New Mexico Territory states that a competing survey must be certified by 2 independent reviewers before it can supersede a recorded deed. If your original deed is recorded at the county seat, the Briggs survey has no legal standing until that process is complete." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people are recalibrating. "How do you know that?" Gideon asked. "I read everything I can get my hands on," she said. "It is a habit." Percival Holt was doing nothing to conceal his delight. He picked up the fencing wire and began wrapping it with great concentration, giving them the pretense of privacy in a room the size of a generous closet. "That is useful information," Gideon said carefully. He was watching her with those dark eyes that had too much in them. "If it is accurate, you could ride to the county seat at St. Fe and check it yourself," she said. "Or you could write to the Territorial Land Office. The statute is there." "I believe you," he said, and the way he said it, quickly, without calculation, told her that he did not say things he did not mean. She went back to the ledgers. He paid for his wire and left. She told herself the warmth she felt was from the afternoon sun coming through the back window. Over the following days, Calico Creek revealed itself to her in the way small towns do gradually, in layers, the public face giving way to the private architecture underneath. She learned that Clara Jennings had come west as a young widow and built the Cactus Rose with money she had earned washing laundry for a mining camp. She learned that Rosa, the waitress, was the daughter of a family who had lived in this region long before any Anglo settler had arrived, and who navigated the particular difficulty of being Mexican in a territory that had been Mexico not 40 years before, with a grace that Nellie found both admirable and heartbreaking. She learned that Harlan Briggs, the man who wanted Gideon's water access, was a land speculator from Denver who had purchased 6 properties in the county in the past year, and was in the process of consolidating creek and river frontage in a way that would eventually give him control over irrigation rights for half the valley. She learned this last piece from Gideon himself. It happened on the 4th day when she was eating her dinner at her usual table, and he came in and stopped at hers and said, formally and with care, "Miss Lockhart, I wonder if you might permit me to ask you something." She gestured to the chair opposite. He sat down with the slightly self-conscious deliberateness of a man who does not often ask permission for things and finds the experience novel. "I wrote to the Territorial Land Office," he said. "You were right about the statute. The Briggs survey cannot supersede my deed without independent certification." "Good," she said. "Crawford at the land office told me this morning that he had spoken with his supervisor in Santa Fe and that Briggs has connections there." He paused. "I am not sure the law is going to be enough." "It rarely is on its own," she said. "I have a neighbor, Tom Rays, whose water access is in the same situation as mine. And there are 2 families on the North Road, the Garcias and the Winthrops, who are in similar circumstances." He was looking at the tablecloth, then at her. "I am thinking of writing a collective petition to the territorial governor, every landowner affected by Briggs's purchases. Put the legal argument in one document and get enough signatures that it cannot be ignored." "That is a good plan," Nellie said. "I am not a skilled writer," he said. It was a straightforward admission, without embarrassment, which she found she respected enormously. "I can say what needs saying plainly enough, but a petition to the governor needs to be more than plain. It needs to be persuasive. It needs to cite the right things." He looked at her, she looked at him. "Mr. Fairchild," she said. "Gideon, please." "Gideon," she said, and the name fit in her mouth in a way she tried not to notice. "Are you asking me to help you write a petition?" "I am asking you," he said carefully, "if you would be willing to. I would pay you for your time." "I do not want your money," she said, and then she stopped because that came out more personally than she intended, and she watched his expression shift accordingly. "I mean," she said, "that I am already employed by Percival, and that this is the kind of work I am capable of. I would rather it be of use than sitting idle." "Then you will do it." She thought about the deed in her father's house in Missouri. She thought about the man with the too wide smile walking away with it. She thought about what it would have meant, at the moment everything was being taken from her father, to have one person who knew the right words. "Yes," she said, "I will do it." They began meeting in the evenings after the dinner rush, at the table in the corner of the Cactus Rose dining room that Clara Jennings quietly reserved for them after the 3rd meeting, saying nothing about it but clearing it before they arrived, and setting a lamp there without being asked. Nellie brought paper and ink from Percival's store, and Gideon brought what he called his records, which were a mixture of deed copies and correspondence, and hand-drawn maps that he laid out on the table with the careful precision of a man accustomed to working with the land. The first evening they worked purely on the substance of the petition, the facts, the affected parties, the legal citations. Nellie wrote and Gideon talked, and she learned that he had come to New Mexico 6 years ago from Indiana, that he had worked his way west on a cattle drive, and used his wages to put a small payment on 40 acres in the Calico Creek Valley, that he had spent 3 of those years digging an irrigation ditch from the creek that now served not just his land but Tom Rays's adjacent property. Because Tom had 2 children and a wife with bad lungs, and could not always do the physical work the ditch required. She learned these things not because he volunteered them as biography, but because they were relevant to the petition, and because she asked questions, and because he answered them directly and without performance. The second evening they worked on language. Nellie wrote a draft and Gideon read it, and he said, "This is very good," and she said, "It is a start." And she explained what she wanted to change and why, and he listened to her explain it with an attention so complete and unguarded that she found herself talking longer than she had intended, caught up in the pleasure of being genuinely heard. The third evening they finished the petition and set it aside to dry and sat for a moment in the particular quiet that falls after a shared task is completed. "Can I ask you something?" Gideon said. "You can ask," she said. "Why are you still here? You said you were passing through." She looked at the lamp flame. "I am still deciding where to go. What are the options? Santa Fe or Colorado? There is teaching work in the mining towns." "Do you like teaching?" "I liked it when the children were interested," she said, "which is not always, though I expect that is true of most work." "It is," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "There is no school in Calico Creek." She looked at him. "There have been 15 children enrolled in Sunday school at the church for the past year," he said, "because there is nowhere else for them to get lessons. Reverend Aldous teaches what he can, but he is more comfortable with scripture than arithmetic." "Is that relevant?" she said. "I expect it is up to you whether it is," he said. She said nothing else about it, and neither did he, and she went up to her room and lay on the bed with her boots still on, the habit of a woman who slept lightly in unfamiliar places, and thought about a town with 15 children and no school. She collected the petition signatures the following week, walking with Gideon to each of the affected properties. It was the first time she had seen his farm, and it was not what she had expected, which she recognized as evidence of the assumptions she had been making without meaning to. The house was small but solid adobe construction, with a wide porch and a kitchen garden that had been planted with real thought, not just the practical things, corn and squash and beans, but lavender along the south wall and a climbing rose that was just coming into bud, pale yellow, working its way up a wooden trellis he had built for it. "Did you plant that?" she asked, meaning the rose. "A woman named Mrs. Aguilar gave me the cutting 3 years ago," he said. "She said roses did better with someone to tend them." "I think she was making a point about something other than roses." Nellie laughed. It was a real laugh, the unguarded kind, and it surprised her. She pressed her hand briefly to her mouth. Gideon looked at her with an expression she could not quite name, something open and careful at the same time, and then he smiled, and it changed his whole face the way sunrise changes a landscape, not creating anything new but revealing what had been there all along in the dark. "You should do that more often," he said. "Laugh." "Yes, I do laugh," she said, recovering. "I know, I have noticed the other kind," he said. "The polite kind, that was different." She looked away toward the rose. "Your petition, Mr. Fairchild," she said, because she needed something to do with the moment. "Gideon," he said, "Gideon, your petition needs to be in Santa Fe by the end of the month." He let her redirect them without comment, which she appreciated, and they went inside to where Tom Ray's was waiting with a pot of coffee and a skeptical expression about the whole enterprise that Nellie dismantled point by point over the next 40 minutes while Tom's wife, Carmela, listened from the kitchen doorway with her arms folded and eventually nodded once in a way that seemed to settle the matter. Tom signed. The Garcias signed 3 days later, the family patriarch, Ernesto Garcia, reading every word of the petition twice before he put pen to paper, asking Nellie a question about the legal citations that she was pleased to be able to answer correctly and completely. The Winthrops signed the same day. A small rancher named Hatcher, who had water rights adjacent to Briggs's most recent purchase, signed after Gideon personally rode out to explain the situation. They had 7 signatures when Harlan Briggs came to Calico Creek. He arrived on a Monday, traveling with 2 men who wore their guns in a way that made the particular statement men in that territory sometimes chose to make with guns. Briggs himself was in his 50s, well-fed, well-dressed, the kind of man whose money was old enough to have grown comfortable. He took the best room at the Cactus Rose, which happened to be the room beside Nellie's, and she heard him through the wall that first evening, his voice carrying without effort, telling his companions that the matter would be resolved quickly and to his satisfaction. She lay in the dark and listened and felt the familiar cold current of recognition. She had heard that voice before, in Missouri, in the parlor of her father's house, wearing a different face. She got up and sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off her right boot and held it in her hands. In the light from the window she could feel the weight of the bills sewn into the lining, the $312, her future, her independence, the accumulated evidence that she could rely on herself. She had carried it so long that the weight of it was a kind of comfort, the way an old scar is a comfort evidence of survival. She put the boot back on. In the morning she told Gideon about Briggs. They were standing on the porch of the Cactus Rose early, before the town properly woke, and she had come down to find him already there. He had ridden into town at first light to tell her the same thing, which meant that someone had already warned him, probably Tom Rays, who made it his business to know what happened in the valley. "He will go to Crawford," Gideon said. "He will," Nellie agreed. "And then Crawford will find a reason to delay sending the petition to Santa Fe. Is there anything we can do to prevent that?" "Send it ourselves," she said. "Directly to the governor's office, not through Crawford." He thought about it. "I would have to ride to Santa Fe. Or," she said, "you could have it sent by telegraph from the station at Las Vegas." She meant Las Vegas, New Mexico, the nearest telegraph station of any size, 2 days' ride east. "It is not the whole petition, but we can send the legal summary and the list of signatures, enough to establish the complaint formally on record." "You thought this through already," he said. "I thought through several things last night," she said. He was looking at her in the morning light with that particular quality of attention that she had begun to notice he gave to things he valued. The horses, the rose on the trellis, the maps of his land. "Nellie," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed in her chest like a small stone dropped into still water. "Yes," she said, keeping her voice even. "Why are you doing this? Not the work. I understand why you help with the work, but this. Coming down here at first light, thinking through several things in the night." She held his gaze. The habit of holding things back was so deep in her it functioned like breath, but she said, "Because it is the right thing to do, and because—" She stopped. "Because," he said very quietly. "Because I have seen what happens when people like Briggs are not stopped," she said. "When everyone assumes someone else will stop them. I have seen what that costs." Her voice was steady, but the thing behind it was not, and she thought he could probably tell. "I would rather be useful than safe." He was quiet for a moment. "I can ride to Las Vegas tomorrow. Take the petition," she said, "and also the deed copy, have both telegraphed, and then leave the originals at the Territorial Land Office in Las Vegas. They have a branch there." "All right," he said. "And Gideon." She said his name with the care she was still learning to take with it. "Be careful. Briggs came with 2 men." The look he gave her then was not quite what she expected. It was not reassurance or bravado. It was something more careful and more real. The look of a man who has just realized that someone in the world is concerned about his safe return. "I will be back in 4 days," he said. He left the next morning. Nellie watched him go from the window of the general store where she was working on Percival's accounts, and she turned back to the ledgers and told herself that the tightness in her chest was simply the unresolved nature of the petition business and nothing more complicated than that. Briggs spent 2 days in town, meeting with Crawford, meeting with the mayor, who was a small, nervous man named Alderson who seemed to have difficulty making eye contact. Nellie watched from her corner of the world and kept her own counsel and smiled at Briggs in the hotel dining room with the smooth, disinterested smile she had learned to deploy against men who made assumptions about women. On the second day, Briggs sat down at a table near hers and said, "You are Miss Lockhart, the bookkeeper." "I am," she said. "Percy Holt's girl." "Percy Holt's employee," she said. "I am not anyone's girl," he smiled. It was the too wide smile, the one that promised things. "I was told you have been helping Fairchild with some kind of paperwork." She set down her coffee cup. "I help with bookkeeping and correspondence. It is work I am paid to do." "Fairchild does not have much to offer by way of payment," Briggs said, with the particular unpleasantness of a man who thinks money is the only language worth speaking. "I manage my own finances," Nellie said. "I do not require your evaluation of other people's." There was a shift in his expression, the smile staying but the warmth behind it, such as it was, draining away. "You are a long way from wherever you started, Miss Lockhart. It pays to make friends with the right people in a new territory." "It pays to know property law," she said pleasantly. "Good evening, Mr. Briggs." She went upstairs and sat with her back against the door and breathed carefully until the anger in her chest had cooled to something manageable. Then she took out her writing materials and wrote down everything Briggs had said, every word she could remember, and dated and signed it, and tucked it into the false bottom of her saddlebag with her money. Gideon came back on the afternoon of the fourth day, riding in from the east with the particular straight-back tiredness of a man who has covered hard ground without stopping more than he needed to. Nellie was coming out of the general store when she saw him come up the main street, and she stopped on the boardwalk and waited. He saw her from half a block away. The tiredness in his face reorganized itself when he saw her, not disappearing but shifting into something else, something warmer and more awake. He tied patience. They had laughed about the coincidence that their horses were both grays, both named things that suggested temperament, her patience and his roan named conviction, and came up the steps to where she stood. "It is done," he said. "The petition summary is on the governor's record as of 2 days ago. The original documents are filed at the Territorial Land Office in Las Vegas." He pulled a receipt from his breast pocket and held it out to her. She read it twice, then looked up. "Crawford cannot suppress this now." "No," he said, "he cannot." They looked at each other in the afternoon sun, and there was a moment of such complete and uncomplicated happiness between them that Nellie felt it like a physical thing, like warmth through glass. "You must be exhausted," she said. "I could eat," he said, "and I wanted to tell you." "You wanted to tell me first," she said before she could stop it. He did not look away. "Yes," he said. They had dinner at their usual table, and the conversation moved easily from the petition to other things, the way it had begun to do over the past weeks. The way that happens when two people have finished the task that gave them permission to be in each other's company, and discover that they do not actually need the task anymore. He told her about his drive through Las Vegas, the strange modernity of it, the telegraph office that could send a message 500 miles in 20 minutes, which still struck him as something between miracle and witchcraft. She told him about her conversation with Briggs, and his expression went briefly dark, the way clear water goes dark over deep ground. "He spoke to you," he said. "It was not quite a question. He tried to suggest that I had chosen the wrong side to help," she said. "I indicated that I was capable of making my own assessments." "I expect you did," Gideon said, and there was in his voice something she had not heard before, a quiet, concentrated attention that was different from his usual careful regard. "He will not try that again." "He might," she said. "Men like him usually try twice." "He should know better than to try with you." She looked at her coffee. "Most men do not see women clearly enough to know what they are up against." "I see you clearly," Gideon said. The room was quiet around them. At other tables, the town went about its evening. Clara Jennings moved between the kitchen and the dining room with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 20 years. Rosa set a plate of pie on a nearby table and smiled at the old couple who received it. "I know," Nellie said, finally, and she meant it as the compliment it was. That night she lay awake for a long time and had an honest conversation with herself. The kind of conversation she had not needed to have in 14 months because the situation had not required it. She had built her life on self-sufficiency, on the knowledge that the only person she could rely on was herself, on the safety of keeping her valuables close and her feelings closer. She had watched her father trust a man and lose everything. She had learned, as thoroughly as a person can learn anything, that trust was a luxury she could not afford. But she also thought about the way Gideon Fairchild answered questions directly, without performance. About the rose on his porch and the irrigation ditch he had dug for a neighbor's sick wife. About the way he had listened to her explain property law in the back room of a general store, listening not because he had to, but because she was saying something worth hearing. About the way he had said, "I wanted to tell you," with no strategy in it. She reached down and pulled off her right boot. She turned it over in her hands in the darkness. The bills were still there, sewn carefully along the lining, $312, her future, her evidence of survival. She had shown no one this. Not in Missouri, not in any of the 4 territories and 9 towns in between, not the left boot and not the right. She had managed everything alone. She held the boot for a long time, and then she put it back on and went asleep. And in her dreams she was walking towards something she could not yet see, and she was not afraid. The response from the governor's office came 12 days later, a letter addressed to Gideon Fairchild at Calico Creek, New Mexico Territory, which Crawford at the land office was obliged to deliver since his office handled the mail, and which arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of May. Gideon brought it directly to where Nellie was working at Percival's store, unopened, with the letter held in both hands like something breakable. She looked at his face and then at the letter and said, "Open it." He did. It was brief, official, and thorough. The governor's office acknowledged receipt of the petition. An independent survey had been ordered to be conducted by a certified party unconnected to any current land purchase in the valley. Pending that survey, all conflicting claims related to the Briggs purchase were to be held in abeyance. Crawford was directed to cease processing any transfers of water rights until the survey was complete. Gideon read it once and then held it out to Nellie without a word. She read it and then set it on the desk. "It is not over," she said, "but the most immediate danger is stopped." "Because of you," he said. "Because of the law," she said. "I just pointed at it." "You pointed at it, you wrote the argument, you advised me on the filing procedure, and you did not run when Briggs tried to intimidate you." His voice was steady, but it had something running underneath it that was not quite steady at all. "Give yourself the credit." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "We did it." He smiled then, the full smile, the sunrise one, and she felt it somewhere between her ribs and was done pretending she did not. The survey was completed by the end of June. It confirmed what Gideon's original deed had shown. The eastern boundary of his claim ran where he said it ran. The creek access was his and had always been his. The independent surveyors additionally found that 2 of Briggs's other property purchases had similarly irregular preliminary surveys, and this finding was forwarded to the Territorial Land Office, and subsequently to a federal inspector who happened to be passing through Santa Fe at a convenient time. Harlan Briggs left the territory in July without ceremony, his 2 armed companions preceding him down the main street of Calico Creek in the early morning light while the town watched. He did not look back. Men like him rarely did. Crawford resigned from the land office in August. The man who replaced him was younger and less comfortable with irregularity. These events happened around Nellie and Gideon the way weather happens around people going about their lives, significant, shaping, but no longer the story's center. The story's center, by then, had shifted. It had shifted on a Sunday in late May, which was the day Nellie went out to the farm for the second time. She had gone to return a property map she had borrowed for reference in the petition, and she had not precisely planned to stay, but Gideon had been in the middle of making bread when she arrived, which was not the activity she had expected, and he had said with the kind of naturalness that was either unconscious or very well managed, "You can leave it on the table. I will be done in a few minutes if you want to sit." She sat on the porch. The yellow rose had come fully into bloom while she was not paying attention to it, and the afternoon smelled of warm earth and something sweet from the kitchen. The desert stretched out to the west in shades of orange, and read that she had stopped being surprised by the way you stop being surprised by things you have come to depend on. He came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the other chair, and they talked for 3 hours without either of them noticing the time pass, which was a thing Nellie had not done with another person in so long that she had stopped expecting it. He told her about Indiana, about his mother, who had taught herself Latin from a book she bought at an auction, and read it aloud at the dinner table until the children could follow along. About his father, who had been a fair man but a hard one, who believed that the world rewarded effort and was not entirely wrong but was not entirely right either. About why he had gone west, not for gold, not for adventure, the things that brought most men, but for space. I needed room to be something I could not have been back there, he said, and then he seemed to consider whether to go further. Back there, I was my father's son and my mother's boy and my neighbor's expectation. Here I am whatever I make of myself. That is why I came west too, Nellie said. She said it before she thought about whether to, which was unusual. Not because it was better, but because it was blank. What happened back there? He asked, gently without pressure. She looked at the rose, she looked at her coffee, she looked at her hands. She told him about her father, about the deed, about the man with the too wide smile. She told it plainly, without drama, the way you tell a thing when you have carried it so long it has grown smooth. She told him what she had taken when she left her savings, her pride, her determination that nothing would ever again be taken from her without her consent. He listened the way he always listened, fully and without interruption until she was done. "I am sorry," he said. And because he did not elaborate, did not offer advice or reassurance or comparisons, but simply said that one thing and meant it completely, she believed him. "I have managed," she said. "Better than that," he said. She looked at him. The afternoon light was long and golden, the way it gets in the high desert in late spring, and it made everything it touched look like something worth keeping. "I have been thinking about the school," she said, because she needed to say something, because the weight of the moment was becoming something she did not quite know how to carry. "Have you?" he said. There was something in his voice, careful, hoping. "There are 15 children who need teaching," she said, "and I am a teacher." "You are many things," he said. "I am a practical person," she said firmly, "and it would be practical to stay." "Yes," he said, "it would." She stayed. She went back to the hotel that evening and wrote a letter to the Territorial Education Office in Santa Fe inquiring about the process for establishing a school in an unincorporated settlement. The reply came 6 weeks later and was encouraging. The church offered its building for weekday instruction. The community raised a modest fund for supplies, 10 families contributing what they could. Percival Holt donated paper and ink. Nellie opened the school in the first week of September, 1883, with 16 students, the original 15 and one more. The infant daughter of the Winthrop family who was too young to learn letters but not too young to be carried to school on her mother's back, while her mother helped set up the desks, which were borrowed sawhorses and planks. She taught Monday through Friday, mornings for the younger children and afternoons for the older ones who could sit longer and focus harder. She was strict about attention and generous about curiosity, and the children responded to both in the way children respond to adults who see them clearly. She kept her room at the Cactus Rose. She kept her boots on when she slept. She kept her fortune where it had always been, close and private and hers. But she had dinner with Gideon 3 evenings a week, and sometimes 4. And occasionally she walked with him on Sunday afternoons out past the edge of town where the desert opened up, and you could see for 50 miles in 3 directions, and the sky was a color that had no name in English, something between blue and violet, and the feeling of standing at the edge of something enormous. On one of those walks in October when the evenings had gone cool and the desert smelled of something dry and particular that she had come to love, he said, "Nellie." "Yes," she said. "I need to tell you something." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. "I have been trying to find the right time," he said. He was looking at the horizon, then at her. I am not sure there is a right time for this, and I have decided the wrong time is better than never." Her heart was doing something it had no business doing, but she kept her face composed. Old habit. "All right," she said. "I love you," Gideon said. Simply, directly, the way he said everything. "I have known it for some time. I did not want to say it until I was certain you would not feel cornered by it. But I need you to know." The desert was very quiet. Somewhere far off a bird called once and was silent. "I'm not easily cornered," Nellie said, and her voice was steadier than she had expected. "No," he agreed, "you are not." She looked at him in the failing light, at the face she had come to know better than she had intended, the steadiness of it, the warmth underneath the steadiness, the dark eyes that saw her clearly and made her feel not exposed by that clarity but recognized by it. "I am afraid of this," she said. "I want you to know that I know that." "I know you are," he said. "I am not asking you to stop being afraid. I am only asking you to know how I feel." "I love you too," she said. And then, because she was Nellie Lockhart and old habits were honest habits, "That terrifies me considerably." He reached out and took her hand, very carefully, the way you take something you have waited a long time to hold. His fingers were warm and rough from work, and they closed around hers like they had always known how. "We can be terrified together," he said. She laughed, the real laugh, and tightened her fingers around his. They walked back to town in the dark, her hand in his, and the stars over the New Mexico desert were extraordinary, and the air was cold and clear, and the world felt exactly the size it needed to be. She did not show him the boots that night. She was not ready for that yet, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. Trust was not a door that opened all at once. It was a series of small windows, opened gradually, as the air inside became fresh enough to need them. But she was thinking about it. That was new. The months that followed were the happiest of her adult life, and she recognized that happiness clearly and without embarrassment, which was itself something new. She had spent so long in the crouch of self-protection that straightening up felt strange, like a physical adjustment after years of guarding a wound. Gideon was not a complicated man to love, she found, in the sense that he did not require maintenance or management. He was exactly what he appeared to be: steady, honest, capable, curious about the world, kind to people in a way that was not performed but simply constituted, like the way a good knife is simply sharp. He did not make promises he did not keep. He did not say things he did not mean. He asked her opinion and listened to the answer, and changed his mind when her argument was better, which was the hardest thing for most people to do, and for him seemed entirely natural. She also found, gradually, that she was telling him things. Not all things, not yet, but more than she had told anyone in years. About the year after Missouri, the drifting, the cold rooms in unfamiliar towns, the particular loneliness of competence unaccompanied by connection. About the books she had read on the road, the territorial land statutes and the property law volumes she had found in the back of a library in Albuquerque and carried in her saddlebag. About her mother, who had died when Nellie was 11, and whom she thought about on quiet mornings with a grief that had long since become a companion rather than an affliction. He listened to all of it with the same attentiveness, and in exchange he gave her his own inventory slowly, equally, the way people exchange things of equal value. He told her about a summer in Kansas City when he had been 24 and had thought he might stay east after all, might find work in a shipping office and live in a room above a laundry, and be the kind of person who walked to work on paved streets. He had lasted 4 months before the contained quality of it pressed against him, so hard he had gone west the next morning, without fully planning to. He told her about the first winter on the New Mexico land, when the cistern froze and the fence line blew down in a storm, and he had sat in the dark in the house he had half built and thought about Indiana, and then decided, very firmly, not to think about Indiana anymore. They were sitting on his porch the evening he told her that, the rose long since past its bloom and the desert going purple in the early winter dusk, and she said, without planning to, "I am glad you did not go back." He looked at her with those eyes that held too much light for the time of day. "So am I," he said. She reached over and took his hand, and it had become natural by now. The way good things become natural, not through repetition exactly, but through rightness. December came in cold and clear, and Calico Creek lit itself with whatever illumination it could manage, candles and oil lamps in the windows. A string of lanterns the Garcias hung outside their shop that swayed in the evening wind and threw warm light on the frozen street. The church held a Christmas service at which Nellie's students performed an uncertain but enthusiastic nativity play that made everyone in the audience either laugh or cry, and in some cases both. Gideon sat beside her in the front pew, shoulder to shoulder, and she was aware of the warmth of him in a way that made the cold church feel entirely comfortable. Afterward, walking home through the bright cold night, he said, "I would like to ask you something." She knew before he said it from the way he said it. She knew, and she felt something open in her chest like a window opened in spring. "Yes," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped with him. "I have not got a ring yet," he said. "I was not planning to do this tonight specifically. I was planning to be more prepared." "You are doing well so far," she said. He took both her hands and held them in the cold air. "Marry me, Nellie. Stay here. I want to build a life with you. A real one, the kind where you know everything and I know everything and neither of us is keeping track of what the other one owes." He paused. "I know you have been careful, I know why. And I am not asking you to stop being careful. I am asking you to be careful with me. Together." She looked at his face in the moonlight, familiar now, the beloved geography of it, the jaw and the dark eyes and the way he was looking at her with everything open and nothing held back. "There is something I need to show you first," she said. He blinked. "All right. Not here. Come back to the hotel." Clara Jennings was already upstairs and the dining room was empty. Nellie lit the lamp on her usual table and sat down, and Gideon sat opposite her with the patient quality that was simply how he was. He did not hurry things, did not fill silences with noise, waited as long as things needed. She bent down and pulled off her right boot. She turned it over and showed him the lining, the careful stitching along the inside edge, the way the thick paper rustled when she pressed it. She worked the lining loose with practiced fingers and laid the bills on the table between them. $312. More now she had added to it over the months in Calico Creek, new earnings folded in with the old. He looked at it, then at her. "I have kept it there since Missouri," she said. "I carried it through 4 territories and 9 towns. I have never shown it to anyone." She paused. "Not the right boot and not the left." She reached down and pulled off the left boot too, and showed him the lining, the folded bills and coins that represented 14 months of accumulated independence. "I show you this," she said, "because showing you this is the thing I could not have imagined doing 6 months ago. Because the boots are the part I kept secret from everything and everyone. Because," she steadied her voice, "because you are the first person since my father died who I trust enough to see where I keep the thing that keeps me safe." Gideon looked at the boots and the money and then at her face, and his expression was so careful and so tender and so completely without any of the greed or condescension or easy reassurance she might have feared, that her last wall, the one she had not even fully known she was maintaining, came down quietly and without protest. "Thank you," he said, "for trusting me with that. It is not the money," she said. "You understand, it is not the money." "I know," he said. "It is the boots." She laughed a little shakily. "It is the boots." He reached across the table and very carefully, very deliberately, he folded her money back into the lining of the right boot and handed it back to her. Not because he did not want her to have it, not because he did not recognize what she was offering, but because he understood that the money was hers and had always been hers and would go on being hers, and that was exactly right. She took the boot from him and held it. "Yes," she said. "Yes," he said. "To the question you asked me outside," she said, "the answer is yes." He stood up from the table and came around it, and she stood too, and he took her face in his hands, very gently, and kissed her. And it was the most honest kiss she had ever experienced, neither tentative nor presuming, but simply true, the physical equivalent of everything he had said and everything she had answered. They were married in February of 1884, in the little church with the crooked cross, by Reverend Aldous, who performed the ceremony with considerable emotion and only a little scripture more than strictly necessary. The whole town came, or near enough. The Reyeses, the Garcias, the Winthrops, Percival Holt, who cried unapologetically into his handkerchief, Rosa from the hotel dining room, who brought a small bouquet she had made from dried desert flowers and pressed it into Nellie's hands at the door of the church. Clara Jennings sat in the front row and watched Nellie walk up the aisle with the expression of a woman who has seen a great many things in her time and is finding this one particularly worth having seen. Gideon stood at the front of the church and watched Nellie come toward him, and he did not look away for a single second, the way a man looks when he is making sure the thing he is seeing is real. Nellie wore her good dress, dark blue, and her hair pinned up with the 2 tortoiseshell pins that had been her mother's, and both boots, obviously, which she thought her mother would have found sensible. When Reverend Aldous came to the part about the ring, Gideon produced one from his breast pocket, a simple gold band, plain and good, which he had ordered from a jeweler in Santa Fe 3 months earlier and kept in increasing anxiety since, checking periodically that it had not fallen out. It fit. They walked back down the aisle as a married couple, while the congregation applauded with the enthusiasm of people who have been waiting through a cold winter for something to celebrate. The reception was at the Cactus Rose, where Clara had laid out more food than the town could reasonably consume, and had brought out a bottle of bourbon she had been saving for an occasion that merited it. Tom Reyes played guitar on the porch, and his wife Carmela sang, and the children from Nellie's school stayed far past their bedtimes and danced in circles until they fell over. Nellie sat at a table with her husband, and the word was strange and good in her mind at the same time, and watched her town celebrate, and she thought about the morning she had ridden into Calico Creek, alone, carrying everything she owned in a saddlebag and 2 boots, expecting nothing. Gideon leaned over and said quietly, close enough that she felt the warmth of his breath, "What are you thinking?" "That I did not expect this," she said. "The party." "Any of it," she said. She looked at him. "You, the school, any of it." "I know," he said. "I did not either." He picked up her hand from the table. "It is better than what I expected." "Yes," she said, "considerably." They moved into the farmhouse on the Valley Road, and Nellie brought her saddlebag and her writing materials and her law books and both boots, and Gideon made room for everything without being asked, adding shelves in the kitchen for the books and a hook on the bedroom door for the saddlebag, and accepting without comment the fact that his wife kept her savings in her footwear, which was, he had told her once, the most practical financial strategy he had ever encountered. She taught school through the spring and into summer and then into a second year, and the school grew. A family named Holloway arrived from Texas with 4 children who had been learning from their mother on the trail, and they enrolled all 4 in the same week. The oldest Holloway boy, James, was 17 and had a talent for mathematics that went considerably beyond what Nellie could teach him, and she wrote a long letter to a college in Albuquerque on his behalf in her best petition language, and he was accepted the following year on the strength of it. And when he left for Albuquerque, he came to say goodbye and shook her hand with the intensity of someone trying to express something for which they did not yet have the words. Ernesto Garcia's daughter, Lucia, had a gift for reading that made her, at 12 years old, the best reader in the school, and Nellie spent extra time with her on Fridays and lent her books from her own collection, and thought about what it might mean for a young Mexican woman in the New Mexico territory to have education behind her, and what it might open. The injustice of the territory was something Nellie thought about often. The way families like the Garcias had been on this land for generations, and now navigated a legal and social world structured by and for people who had arrived later and with louder claims. She talked about it with Gideon on the long Sunday evenings, and he listened and thought about it too, and they agreed that the most useful things they could do were the specific things in front of them: the school, the petition work, the small, careful daily business of treating people with equal regard. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough, but she did not believe in the luxury of despair. In the spring of 1885, Nellie gave birth to their first child, a boy they named Henry James Fairchild, the James for no one in particular and the Henry for Gideon's maternal grandfather, who had been, by all accounts, a man of integrity. Henry arrived in March with a full head of dark hair and the immediately apparent opinion that the world was not quite arranged to his satisfaction, which Nellie recognized as a characteristic he came to honestly from both sides. Tom Rays rode over the morning after Henry's birth and stood on the porch and congratulated Gideon with the dignity of a man who values the correct moment for ceremony. And Carmela Rays came inside and held the baby and said something in Spanish to Nellie that Nellie did not entirely understand but which felt like a blessing, and probably was. The right boot, now retired from financial duty since Nellie had opened an actual bank account in the town of Las Vegas on a trip the previous fall, the Calico Creek area having no bank, sat on the bedroom shelf where she could see it. She had taken the money out of the lining when she opened the account, unstitching the seams herself, and she had kept the boot. It seemed important to keep it. It was the boot she had carried since Missouri, and it was the boot she had shown Gideon across the dining room table at the Cactus Rose, and those were the two most significant things that had happened to it, and they seemed worth remembering. Henry grew into a determined toddler who approached every object in the house as though testing it for structural integrity. He had Nellie's stubbornness and Gideon's patience, which was an unusual combination that produced a child who took a long time to decide what he wanted, and then pursued it without deviation. He was universally adored by everyone in Calico Creek, which Nellie found mildly alarming and Gideon found entirely appropriate. In the summer of 1887, they had a daughter, Clara Rose, the Clara for Clara Jennings, who received the news of the naming with a dry calm that did not disguise how moved she was, and the rose for the climbing rose on the porch, which was still there, still yellow, still blooming each May with the reliable beauty of a thing that has found its right place. Clara Rose arrived in the world with none of her brother's protestations and an expression of philosophical resignation that her mother recognized as the face of someone already composing their response to a disappointing situation, and loved her immediately and completely for it. With 2 children, the house needed the room that Gideon added onto the east side in the fall of 1887, with Tom Rays helping on the heavier work and Ernesto Garcia's eldest son Louis contributing on the weekends, all of them working in the good-natured way of men building something together, measuring twice and cutting once, and arguing companionably about the best angle for the roof joists. Nellie ran the school with an assistant by then, a young woman named Adeline Porter who had come to Calico Creek with her husband, a new deputy, and had been a teacher in Arkansas and was glad to find work suited to her background. Adeline handled the younger children and Nellie taught the older ones, and between them they had managed to establish a curriculum that got several of their students to a standard that qualified them for continued education in Albuquerque or Santa Fe. The school had a proper building by 1888, not the church anymore but a purpose-built structure of adobe and timber on a lot that the town council, which now existed, Calico Creek having incorporated in 1886, had set aside on Nellie's petition, which she had written herself, and presented at the first council meeting with the confidence of a woman who had written a petition to a territorial governor and won. The land office stayed clean under its new management. Crawford was eventually tried in Santa Fe for his role in the Briggs scheme and found guilty of fraud in connection with 2 property transfers, a conclusion that Nellie read about in the territorial newspaper with a satisfaction she did not bother to conceal. Briggs himself was never formally charged, as the evidence was insufficient or the connections in Santa Fe more durable than hoped, which was not justice, but was perhaps the territory's ordinary version of it. He did not return to Calico Creek, and the properties he had purchased were eventually sold to their adjacent landowners at fair prices, negotiated through the Territorial Land Office with the Independent Survey standing as the framework. Tom Ray's water access was formally confirmed, and the irrigation ditch that he and Gideon had dug together years before was now shared with 2 additional properties, the agreement written up properly and filed at the county seat. The ditch ran clear through dry summers and provided water to enough land that the valley had a productive character it might not have had otherwise. It was a small thing in the scale of the territory's history, but it was a thing that happened because people had done the right work at the right time, and Nellie thought that most good things were like that. On a September evening in 1889, with both children in bed and the desert evening cooling around the adobe walls of the house, Gideon and Nellie sat on the porch the way they had got into the habit of doing, each with a cup of something, coffee for her, tea for him, a preference she had teased him about for 5 years, and intended to continue teasing him about for considerably longer. The yellow rose had finished its summer bloom, and the last few petals lay on the porch boards in the evening wind. Clara Rose had tried to collect them that afternoon and make a pile of them, a project whose purpose remained unclear but whose urgency had been absolute. "Henry wants to help with the next planting," Gideon said. "He is 6. He is very competent at 6. He broke the kitchen door handle attempting to demonstrate its structural weakness. "He was conducting research," Gideon said, and she could hear the smile in it. She looked out at the dark. The stars were doing their extraordinary thing again over the desert, the thing she had never stopped noticing no matter how many nights she saw it. "Do you remember," she said, "the night I showed you the boots?" He was quiet for a moment. "I remember it very well." "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "I could see that. You were so careful with them," she said, "when you folded the money back in and handed the boot back to me." "It was yours," he said simply. "It has always been yours." She set down her cup and reached over and took his hand, and the desert stretched out before them, familiar and vast and full of the particular silence that is not empty but full of everything that does not need to be said. "I love this life," she said. It came out simply, without ceremony, the way truths do when they have been present so long they no longer require announcement. "So do I," he said. "Very much." They sat in companionable quiet while the stars turned overhead and the desert settled into night. The lamp inside threw warm light through the window, and she could hear, faintly, the small sounds of the children sleeping, Henry's occasional determined shift in his bed, Clara Rose's stillness, which was always more absolute than any child should manage. Nellie thought about the woman who had ridden into Calico Creek with her fortune in her boots, and her heart barricaded behind 14 months of sensible caution. She thought about everything that had required her to believe in the right statute at the right moment, the right word in the right petition, the decision to stay past 2 weeks, the evening on the desert walk when she had said the terrifying true thing out loud. She thought about the right boot on the bedroom shelf, the stitching opened out and smooth now, the lining empty and flat, kept not for what it held anymore but for what it had meant to hold it, for the whole long journey from Missouri to here. She had built this. They had built it together. The school with its 32 students and its proper adobe walls, the house with its new east room and the rose on the trellis. The life that contained 2 sleeping children and a man who listened to her the way good men listen, not waiting to respond, but actually hearing. Henry would be given his own small plot of garden in the spring, she decided. He would probably test its structural integrity in some fashion, but there was something to be said for giving a determined person the right thing to be determined about. Clara Rose would have books, as many as Nellie could find and bring home, and Nellie knew every bookseller in Santa Fe and 2 in Albuquerque, and she was not shy about writing letters. There was more land to the north of their claim that had been available for purchase since the Briggs situation resolved, and they had been considering it for 3 years and had the savings now to act on it. The school needed a proper library. She had been writing that petition in her head for a year. The territory was changing. New Mexico would be a state eventually. The argument was building toward it slowly, and when it came, there would be questions of land title and educational standards, and the rights of communities that had been here long before anyone called the land a territory. And those questions would need people willing to ask them carefully and loudly, and with the right citations. And she had been preparing for a long time without entirely knowing what she was preparing for. "Are you planning something?" Gideon said, which told her that her silence had taken on a particular quality that he recognized after 6 years of marriage. "Several things," she said. "The land to the north. Among others, the library petition. I may have mentioned it once or twice. 14 times, he said, with the warm precision of a man who keeps a loving count of the things that matter to him. She smiled. "Then I expect you know I am serious about it." "I know you are always serious about the things you mention 14 times. He squeezed her hand. "Tell me." She turned to face him on the porch. This man she had trusted slowly and completely. This man who had handed back her boot. This man who had waited without pressure for every window she opened, and walked through every door she offered with the careful regard of someone who understood what it cost. She told him about the library and about the land to the north, and about what she thought a proper territorial library might mean for the children of Calico Creek, and for Lucia Garcia, who at 17 was now helping with the younger students, and had the mind and the character for far more than anyone in the territory had yet thought to offer her. She talked for a long time, and he listened, the way he always listened, and the stars turned over them, and the desert held its ancient silence around their small bright house, and the rose on the trellis moved gently in the night wind, and inside their children slept, and the right boot was on the shelf, and the money was in the bank in Las Vegas earning its small interest, and Nellie Lockhart, who had once been a woman alone on a long road with her fortune hidden in her boots and her heart hidden in the same general region, was home. She finished talking. Gideon said, "Let's do all of it." She looked at him. "The land, the library petition, whatever Lucia needs, all of it." He was smiling, the full one. "You have been planning it long enough. Let's build it." Nellie Lockhart, who was now also Nellie Fairchild, though she was still sometimes Nellie Lockhart in the schoolroom and in the petitions because a woman's name belongs to her too, reached over and kissed her husband in the cool September dark, unhurried and completely sure of herself, and felt the whole long road from Missouri settle into something that was no longer a road at all, but a place where she had arrived and intended to remain. The yellow rose put out one last pale bud in October, impossibly late for the season, which Clara Jennings called a miracle and Gideon called adaptation and Nellie called stubbornness, and which bloomed quietly through 3 cool weeks before the first hard frost, and which was beautiful in each of those weeks, and was worth all the growing season that had gone before it. The library petition was approved the following spring. The land to the north was purchased that summer. Lucia Garcia, with a letter of recommendation from Nellie that deployed every persuasive technique Nellie had developed from 2 years of territorial petition writing, was accepted into a teacher's training program in Albuquerque. And when she came back to Calico Creek 3 years later with her certificate and her clear, capable mind, Nellie hired her as the lead teacher of the lower school and took on the upper school herself. And the two of them ran the Calico Creek School with a combination of rigor and generosity that produced students who knew both what to think and how to think it, which is the best thing a school can produce. Henry Fairchild, at 8, grew 3 vegetable patches of increasing ambition, and in the fall of 1893 presented his mother with a pumpkin of such extraordinary size that Percival Holt insisted on displaying it in the window of the general store for a week, where it was regarded with admiration by the entire valley. Henry accepted this acclaim with a composure that his father recognized as inherited from his mother, and his mother recognized as all his own. Clara Rose, at 6, had read every book in the school library twice, and was working her way through her mother's personal collection with the methodical appetite of a person who has found their right occupation. She asked questions constantly about everything, about the words and the ideas and the way one thing connected to another, and Nellie answered every one of them. And on the evenings when she did not know the answer, she said so, and then they found the answer together. That was the best thing she could think of to give her daughter, not the answers, but the practice of looking. On the 10th anniversary of the day Nellie had ridden into Calico Creek, she walked the length of the main street from one end to the other in the morning light, the way she had on her second day, learning the town. The street was different now, wider, better kept, with a new post office and a dry goods store that had replaced the old saloon, and a notice on the door of the school announcing the autumn enrollment. But the Cactus Rose was still there, its sign still painted in Clara Jennings's hand, and Percival Holt's General Store was still on the corner, and the church had a new cross on its roof, straight this time, and the land office had clean windows and an honest surveyor who had done 3 straight surveys in the past year and produced results that corresponded to what the deeds showed. She walked back up the street and turned onto the valley road and kept walking until the town gave way to the desert, and the desert opened up to the north and east, and the morning light was long and gold over the whole enormous country. She had $47 in her left boot. Old habits. She stood there for a moment in the silence, feeling the familiar weight against her ankle, and she thought about who she had been when that weight had been the most important relationship in her life. She thought about what it had taken and what it had given and what it had, in the end, asked her to release. Behind her, she heard boots on the road. Gideon came up beside her and stopped, looking out at the same view. He had Henry on his hip, which was getting impractical at Henry's current size, but which Henry still occasionally demanded on grounds that remained his own business. Clara Rose was walking alongside, holding her father's other hand, already looking at the horizon with the considering expression of a person taking inventory. "You came the long way," Gideon said. "I always come the long way," she said. "I know." He shifted Henry on his hip. "It is how you think." Clara Rose let go of her father's hand and walked forward a few steps, tilting her face up at the sky. "Mama," she said, "where does it stop?" Nellie looked at the desert and the sky and the long morning light. "It does not," she said. "That is the point." Her daughter considered this with the seriousness it deserved, and Gideon looked over Clara Rose's head at Nellie with that steady, warm regard that had been the most reliable thing in her world for a decade. And she looked back at him across the good distance between them, and knew, as she knew the weight in her left boot and the color of the desert sky and the sound of her children's voices, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The road from Missouri had been long and she had carried everything herself, and she would not change a mile of it, because the whole long road had led here, to this valley and this man and these children and this particular morning. And here was where the road had been going all along, even when she could not see it. She reached over and took Gideon's free hand, and they stood in the morning light with their children beside them and the whole wide country ahead, and the boot was on her foot where it belonged, and the money was in the bank where it belonged, and her heart was where it had finally found its way, and it belonged there too. It had always been going to belong there. She had just needed the road to show her.